I would like to invite Matthew Murray. He's a professor at Columbia University in the US. He's actually traveling from the US for this event. He's an international expert on innovating solutions to systemic corruption. So I think you are definitely the person to help us here in Bulgaria, and looking forward to your words. Thank you, Andy.
Well, thank you, Oliver. And thank you, the American Chamber of Commerce. Thank you to the America for Bulgaria Foundation for hosting me here today. It is a true honor to be here today with this esteemed group of ambassadors from the United States and Europe and representatives of the international and local business community. And my congratulations to all of you on convening this very topical conference on the subject of the rule of law in the business environment at this critical time for Bulgaria and for the world, when the future rules of the game of globalization are being debated, decided, and determined in forums like this taking place across the world. My purpose this morning is to address how the private sector in Bulgaria can identify and develop new opportunities to strengthen the rule of law in this nation and in the Balkan region. In particular, how should you as business leaders define the rule of law in Bulgaria? What are new approaches for the private sector to take collective action in support of the rule of law? Broadly, how can you strengthen the rule of law and counter corruption to help achieve new levels of economic prosperity? Even more broadly, how does the rule of law bolster Bulgaria's independence and sovereignty as a nation? How does your legal culture and business ecosystem express the values that Bulgarian citizens share? Let me start with an agreed definition of the rule of law as defined by the United Nations. The rule of law is a principle of governance in which all persons, institutions, and entities, public and private, including the state itself, are accountable to laws that are published, equally enforced, and independently adjudicated, and which are consistent with the international human rights norms and standards. The rule of law requires measures to ensure adherence to the principles of supremacy of the law, equality before the law, accountability to the law, fairness in the application of the law, separation of powers, participation in decision-making, legal certainty, avoidance of arbitrariness, and procedural and legal transparency. Now, notwithstanding this very robust United Nations definition of the rule of law, we know that the definition is hardly universal. In fact, the term rule of law has been used in vague and ambiguous ways since its coinage by a British jurist, Albert Venditti, in the 19th century. Scholars now distinguish between two kinds of rule of law: the minimal, thin, or formalistic variety, and the deep, thick, or substantive variety. The thin and formalistic type of rule of law includes open and legitimate procedures for making laws, transparency of laws and regulations, laws that are prospective, clear, consistent, and stable, and enforcement of laws in a just and impartial manner. The thick or substantive adds that the law must also have a moral basis, that it must be good law, that is based on a normative foundation beyond the state and its laws, such as religion, natural law, or the international law of human rights. Now, in many countries, including countries of the former Soviet Union, we encounter yet a third type, super thin, or the imitation of the rule of law, where the laws are changeable, easily manipulated, and selectively enforced by rulers. In many of these countries, the rule of law has indeed been replaced by the law of rulers, or by what is called the iron law of oligarchy. The iron law of oligarchy is that powerful, connected, networked groups are above the law. They are embedded in the system of governance, and they control key sectors of the economy and levers of law enforcement. Thus, we are here today to discuss the rule of law in Bulgaria. But we need to first recognize that the rule of law itself is under significant pressure regionally and globally. There is a correlation between globalization, the rise of authoritarian states and transnational corruption, and the decline of the rule of law. The iron law of oligarchy has prevented rule of law-based institutions from taking root in the former Soviet Union, in parts of Eastern and Central Europe, and in parts of the Balkans. To begin then to address this conflict, it is very important to consider how did we get here? The root causes of this tension between the rule of law and the iron law of oligarchy. As the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union was dissolved, it appeared that capitalism had prevailed over communism as the optimal way to organize and grow economies. But capitalism is not monolithic. There are different types of capitalism: big corporate, entrepreneurial, state-guided, and oligarchic. And the role of government differs profoundly in each of these types. In the post-Soviet region, the legacy of central planning could have led to a state-guided model geared to maximize societal growth by investing in specific sectors, goods, and services until such time as it was replaced by a more entrepreneurial form of capitalism. But instead, countries moved in the direction of oligarchic capitalism. They were shaped by strong feudal traditions and patrimonial traditions from pre-Soviet times, when czars, their boyars, and clans controlled the national wealth by extracting rents from peasants, prohibiting ownership of private property, and stifling the growth of modern industry. Drawing on imperial pre-Soviet and Soviet traditions, leaders in the post-Soviet region displayed oligarchic tendencies to survive the transition to capitalism by creating new networks of loyal patrons based on shared interest. At this time of transition, many were convinced that reforms to instill free markets, free trade, to conduct privatization would inexorably lead to create demand for the rule of law to protect private property. But we did not see clearly the difference between an individual owning an asset and an individual controlling an asset, of which he or she is not the sole owner. Oligarchic capitalism was built on control rights, which enable one to take another's assets. Control rights undermine more general property rights because they make it easy to steal. Indeed, they give those with control rights an interest in the persistence of a weak and corrupt state. So when the law of oligarchy prevails, formal government decision-making processes are indeed captured by informal networks of political and business elites who exert significant control over allocation of public resources. Corruption becomes a central organizing principle of governments. And in the last 10 years, we have witnessed state efforts to expand the iron law of oligarchy. On the one hand, oligarchs cannot be contained within their own borders. They seek to enjoy the fruits of a rules-based system internationally, including selling on global markets, access to finance, hiding assets abroad, investing in real estate and other companies in foreign markets. On the other hand, they also seek to export corruption and cronyism to capture other nations that have a thin rule of law. As a result, the rule of law itself has become a strategic battleground, what has come to be known as lawfare. Lawfare is the battle between the rule of law and the iron law of oligarchy. But of course, you all know this, and you have done battle in lawfare, and you have seen how it can undermine the most well-intentioned efforts at rule of law reform. When reforms are made to introduce independence, accountability, transparency, and a level playing field, oligarchic networks can act to subvert, outmaneuver, and outlast these reforms. They can, and they do, thwart real business competition in the market. The question now is, how should you as business leaders respond to lawfare in Bulgaria and in the region? How do you move Bulgaria from a thin to a thick rule of law state? First, part of the answer is by taking initiative through collective action. You as a business community should consider that you really cannot wait for the next Bulgarian government to coalesce around rule of law reform. Yes, a pro-government reform, a pro-reform government is a condition of success, but it is not the starting point, and as history has shown, nor is it sustainable. Instead, business, well-organized and networked as a group, has significant market power. Business can be a change agent for society. Business can form a powerful rule of law constituency. I note that business leaders of many nations are represented here today. Not just American, but the United Kingdom, France, Switzerland, Germany, Greece, and Sweden. I note that the Bulgarian Chamber of Commerce is also represented. This is important. You have already taken the first step. Second, collective action requires you to consider a dedicated effort to building faith and belief in the rule of law. In other words, as you evaluate how to develop effective policies, laws, and institutions and tools to build the rule of law, you must also tackle the larger question of beliefs, trust, and collective behavior. And third, to instill belief and trust, you must consider how to build a rule of law on a foundation of Bulgarian norms and values. How can your legal culture and business ecosystem support the creation of a thick rule of law? Where does Bulgaria stand on this fundamental question of whether a citizen or business truly owns or simply controls its assets? Have you made the transition to a country that honors and respects private property? It is important here to note that this is a matter of human rights of Bulgarian citizens. Enjoyment of private property is a human right under international human rights law, under the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 1, Protocol 1. European states have agreed that private property is a human right. Private property is a natural expression of John Locke's theory of liberty, and protection of property rights is a form of human expression. Fourth and finally, consider the military adage that it takes a network to defeat a network. Networks of individuals with a stake in the iron law of oligarchy will try to defeat reform and institution building, organize and sustaining a new constituency for the rule of law faces strategic uncertainties. It requires building a large constituency that has belief and faith that the rule of law will be enforced, and therefore behavior on a mass scale can be changed following that belief. The probability of a transition to a thick rule of law, therefore, depends on the size and the reach of the constituency that demands it. This requires an approach to reform that is more focused on creating behavior change, horizontal change, through shared interests and values, and quite importantly, trust and confidence. I know that this may sound a bit theoretical, maybe, but ask yourself, why have rule of law reforms in Bulgaria not worked? The theory of change deriving the rule of law reform in Bulgaria, really in any country, is foundational. And you are hardly alone in this. There are long-standing efforts by the private sector to organize collective initiatives to counter corruption globally, regionally, and by sector. And there is practical help available from the America for Bulgaria Foundation, from the Center for International and Private Enterprise in the United States, and from the Basel Institute of Governance in Europe, and many others. These organizations provide advice and resources on collective action to companies, business associations, NGOs, multi-stakeholder groups around the world, and they help to develop and facilitate specific collective action initiatives that bring together business and other stakeholders. But while theoretical, there really is no mystery here. The goal is to build Bulgaria's future on the foundation of the protection of private property as an absolute principle in order to attract smart money, to attract smart capital, to foster economic growth that is equitable, with access to economic opportunity and empowerment of entrepreneurs who are rewarded for their innovation. Entrepreneurial capitalism is the goal, and this triumphs when the law is built on fundamental respect for sanctity of contract and the human right of private property. Thank you.